At 3:17 a.m., an FP-1 long-range drone was already 90 minutes into its flight, cruising 60 meters above the darkened steppe at 150 kilometers per hour. Its target sat on the eastern apron of Yeysk military airfield, a Beriev Be-200 PS amphibious aircraft, one of only 3 left in Russia's military. The crew was asleep. They had no idea that in 44 minutes, a drone worth 47,000 euros would burn an aircraft that Russia had contracted at over $40 million and could never replace. Its body was epoxy resin and plywood. Its warhead weighed 120 kilograms. They called it strategic depth. That night, it became a runway fire. The FP-1 had launched from a concealed ramp somewhere behind the Ukrainian front. A small solid-fuel booster pushed it off a short rail to roughly 35 meters, where the propeller engine caught and the booster fell away. Within seconds, the drone was level, nose down, trimmed for low altitude. Between the launch point and Yeysk, still 110 kilometers to the southeast, lay open steppe, the Sea of Azov, and whatever air defenses Russia had placed along the coast. The FP-1's mission profile was simple: fly low, fly slow, arrive unseen. The airframe made that possible. Epoxy resin and plywood, materials chosen not for cost, but for radar. At 60 meters altitude, the composite skin scattered X-band energy at grazing angles, producing a return smaller than a large bird. The FP-1's radar cross-section measured roughly 0.01 square meters. For comparison, a Pantsir-S1's automated detection threshold was calibrated for targets above 0.1 square meters. The FP-1 was 10 times smaller than the minimum the system was designed to notice. Its navigation did not depend on satellites. The avionics package used inertial reference paired with terrain-matching algorithms that compared the ground below against a stored digital elevation map. Every ridge, every road crossing, every irrigation canal mapped to the meter. When Russian jammers along the Azov corridor flooded the L-band spectrum, and they did continuously, the FP-1 did not react. Its guidance had never been listening to GPS in the first place. The jammer was smothering a frequency the drone had never used. Somewhere over the Sea of Azov, the operator's video feed flickered. The drone was beyond direct line of sight from the ground station. A relay link, the method undisclosed, the signal chain classified, kept the feed alive, grainy, compressed, latency measured in hundreds of milliseconds. But it was enough. Above the water, the only sound was the thin whine of the FP-1's propeller engine, a noise that, from 60 meters, would never reach the surface. The operator could see coastline ahead, lights along the shore, and the dark geometry of a military runway. Yeysk was 30 kilometers ahead. That night, the FP-1 was not alone. Across Russian-held territory, the Unmanned Systems Forces had launched 55 fire missions against 23 separate targets: air defense batteries, ammunition ships, logistics nodes. Yeysk's air defense operators were already fielding reports from adjacent sectors, filtering through contact alerts that had been piling up since midnight. Their attention was divided before the FP-1 ever crossed the coastline. At the base, the air defense network was built for a different kind of threat. A Tor-M2 battery sat on the northern perimeter, its phased array radar sweeping the sky with a 3-second rotation. The system could track up to 48 targets per rotation and engage 4 simultaneously, launching missiles effective between 1 and 15 kilometers at altitudes from 10 to 10,000 meters. Its operators have been cycling through contacts all night. None had resolved into a confirmed threat. Covering the eastern apron, the side where the Be-200 was parked, a Pantsir-S1 carried 12 missiles and twin 30mm autocannons. Together, they formed a layered defense capable of handling cruise missiles, jets, and helicopters. On paper, it was more than enough. The Tor-M2's radar acquired the contact at 27 kilometers, the moment the FP-1 crossed the radar horizon at its altitude of 60 meters. The return registered, but it measured 0.01 square meters, and the system's automated detection logic was calibrated to prioritize targets above 0.1. The contact was auto-sorted into the clutter track and flagged for manual review. On the operator's screen, it was a blip drifting south-southeast at 150 kilometers per hour. The operator hesitated. A contact that slow and that small could be a bird, a weather artifact, or a piece of agricultural debris caught in a thermal. Contact bearing 195, speed 150, classification pending. He toggled manual override. Manual override meant restarting the engagement sequence from scratch. Target reclassification, threat assignment, fire control handover. The Tor's tracking radar needed 3 consecutive sweeps to establish a stable fire control solution on a target this small. 9 seconds. In 9 seconds at 150 kilometers per hour, the drone covered 375 meters. And the operator had already lost 5 seconds deciding whether the contact was real. 14 seconds gone. The drone was now at 25 kilometers. At 150 kilometers per hour, it would cross the Tor's 15-kilometer maximum engagement range in 6 minutes. The crew had already burned 14 seconds of that window on classification. The Tor fired. 2 9M338 missiles accelerated to Mach 2.5 and tracked toward the contact. But in those 14 seconds, the FP-1 had begun its descent, dropping from 60 meters to 40 as the terrain-matching system nudged it lower over flat coastal farmland. At 40 meters, the missile's semi-active radar seekers had to discriminate a target producing 0.01 square meters of return from ground clutter producing 10 times that. The first missile's seeker locked onto a return 600 meters short. It was the ground. The missile hit a wheat field. The second missile's proximity fuse triggered at the calculated intercept point, but the fragmentation cone passed 14 meters above. The drone was lower than the seeker's last altitude solution by the time the warhead detonated. Contact still bearing 195, still moving. And then it got worse. The Tor crew transmitted a contact update to the Pantsir-S1 battery covering the eastern apron. Contact still tracking, bearing 195, missiles expended. The handoff data carried the drone's last confirmed altitude, 60 meters. But by the time the Pantsir's tracking radar slewed to the bearing and began searching at that altitude gate, the FP-1 was at 32 meters and still descending. The search gate was set 28 meters too high. The Pantsir's screen showed nothing. The operator widened the gate 7 seconds. The radar reacquired the contact at 11 kilometers inside the Pantsir's 20-kilometer missile envelope, but the system needed a converging fire control solution, and the drone's altitude was oscillating between 28 and 38 meters as terrain-matching corrections nudged it over an irrigation ditch. The tracking algorithm, designed for steady-state targets, struggled to hold a lock that jittered vertically by 10 meters every 2 seconds. The fire control solution refused to converge. At 4 kilometers, the operator switched to guns. The Pantsir's twin-barrel autocannons could deliver 5,000 rounds per minute of 30mm steel. At 150 kilometers per hour, the drone would cross the 4-kilometer gun envelope in 96 seconds. That should have been enough, but the fire control radar was fighting the ground. At 30 meters altitude, each tracking update carried a position error of roughly 8 meters. The radar could not cleanly separate the drone from the surface beneath it. The gun rounds walked in a cone behind and below the drone's actual position. Tracers lit the sky east of the runway. 60 seconds left in the envelope. 40. The rounds kept scattering. None of them touched the FP-1. At 1.2 kilometers, the drone crossed the Pantsir's missile minimum arm distance. The 1,200 meters of warhead needed to arm were behind it now. There was nothing left to fire but the guns that had already missed. The operator's feed sharpened. The FP-1's nose camera was looking almost straight down, the terminal dive beginning from 200 meters altitude. On the screen, the eastern apron materialized in pale thermal contrast. A fuel truck near a taxiway, ground equipment scattered around a blast shelter, camouflage netting draped over a shape on an adjacent pad. And there, parked in the open under the airfield lights, its twin jet nacelles catching the glow, the Be-200 PS. 45,000 kilograms of aluminum, titanium, avionics, and jet fuel. Built at the Irkut plant, contracted at over $40 million, one of only 3 in Russian military service, and the production line that built it had closed years ago. The tooling was gone, the suppliers had scattered. Russia no longer had the means to build a fourth. The FP-1 did not need the operator anymore. He made one last correction, 2 degrees left, and released the controls. The terminal dive was pre-programmed, 55 degrees nose down, accelerating under gravity, no further input required, 4 seconds to impact. 120 kilograms of high explosive struck the fuselage junction between the wing root and the forward engine nacelle, the point where structural spars, fuel lines, and hydraulic runs converged into the densest concentration of combustible material on the airframe. A flat concussion rolled across the apron. The blast ruptured the center fuel tank, and thousands of liters of jet fuel ignited in a fireball that engulfed the Be-200 from nose to empennage. Secondary fires reached the engine nacelles within seconds. Compressor blades at operating temperature acted as heat sinks that accelerated the burn through the titanium cowlings. The composite wing panels curled and separated. Within 2 minutes, the fire was self-sustaining and beyond suppression. A second drone carved through the camouflage netting on the adjacent pad and struck a Ka-27 naval helicopter. The nets had hidden it from satellites, but done nothing against a camera looking straight down in the dark. The 12,000-kilogram airframe took a direct hit. Its fate stayed contested. The strike did not. By dawn, satellite imagery was already circulating. The Be-200 PS was a blackened outline on the apron, landing gear visible, fuselage gone. The Ukrainian claim became a burn scar visible from orbit. Yeysk did not fail because its defenses were absent. A Tor-M2 fired 2 missiles. A Pantsir-S1 cycled through missiles and guns. Both systems engaged within their published specifications. That was the problem. The specifications assumed a target flying at aircraft speed, producing an aircraft-class radar return at aircraft altitude. The FP-1 was none of those things. It cruised at 150 kilometers per hour, slower than the targets these radars were built to kill. It produced a radar cross-section of 0.01 square meters, smaller than a pigeon. It flew at 60 meters and dove to 30, and it cost 47,000 euros. On one side, an epoxy and plywood drone with a 120-kilogram warhead launched from a rail in a forest. On the other, a rare amphibious aircraft worth over $40 million, one of 3, now one of 2, from a production line that no longer exists. Russia did not lose a fighter. It did not lose a truck. It lost a flying boat it cannot replace. Somewhere along the Azov coast, another FP-1 is already waiting on a ramp. The line for those still runs.